All right, welcome back to the Think Like a Teacher podcast. This episode, we're featuring Chandler Bishop, who is a teacher here at West Jordan High School. Go ahead and introduce yourself. How'd you get into teaching? Why are you here at West Jordan?
I have an interesting pathway to teaching. My name's Chandler Bishop. I'm a language arts teacher and the IB coordinator at West Jordan High School. So I went to school and trained as an actor. I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, moved to New York City and pursued acting for several years, got into marketing and had a successful marketing business with Broadway shows, off-Broadway shows, and television. Had a panic attack one day that I needed to go back to school, so I went back and finished my bachelor's degree. And I just loved like literature and thinking about like deep thoughts about history and literature and philosophy. Yeah. And that kind of got me more interested in being a teacher. So after I graduated, I went to St. John's University and got my master's degree in education. So it was kind of like a career switch focused program. It's that kind of master's degree. And began teaching in New York City. And eventually wound up teaching at the college that I got my bachelor's degree, the City University of New York. And then my wife and I decided we wanted to have children, and a one-bedroom apartment in Queens was not ideal for that.
I don't imagine.
So I started applying so I'm like, we should move back to Salt Lake City where I have family, we can get support, stuff like that. Yeah. And so I started applying at schools, and I was actually offered like 4 different jobs here. And I chose West Jordan High School because the principal, Mike Kochever at the time, was like, hey, we have this science fiction fantasy class.
Okay.
Would you like to teach that? And I was like, that's definitely up my alley.
So
that was ultimately like what made me decide to come to West Jordan over like Copper Hills, Granger, and Skyline all offered me jobs as well. Yeah.
Awesome. So having been here for a while, I'm sure you've interacted with those other schools. Do you have any like that FOMO, like, oh, I made the wrong choice, I wish I was somewhere else? Or
No, I don't feel that way at all. So the Skyline job was actually a theater position, and I didn't understand, and my apologies to any theater teachers listening, how demanding time-wise that job is.
Right.
And Copper Hills, I'm sure, would have been great. The principal there at the time was very nice. He was very disappointed when I turned it down. He really put the guilt trip on me.
Oh man!
But I've liked West Jordan the whole time I've worked here. So
that's cool. And I'm kind of the same way. I student taught here, and this is where I've been the whole time.
Yeah,
about 10 years. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I'm in my 11th year.
Yeah.
So you must have student taught like
I think my second
year. Yeah. So that's funny.
That is interesting. Cool. So, and now you're also doing the IB coordinating.
Yes.
Walk through that just a little bit before we get into the meat.
So I kind of like do a lot of recruiting in middle schools, and I talk to a lot of our sophomores and try and get them interested in doing the diploma program. So they take 6 classes plus the theory of knowledge. They do the extended essay. And then I also register students and do a lot of like the admin work for like making certain that the school is doing all the things that IB wants us to be doing, making sure all of our teachers have certificates from workshops for each of the classes that they're teaching and stuff like that. Okay. So it's pretty exciting. I really think it's a very cool, very interesting program that helps kids. So.
Yeah, and I feel like as an IB teacher, you just mentioning how you're very interested in like the deep thought of things that seems really at the core of what we try to help our students understand within IB.
It's important for us to remember why we think it's important too, because I was like very excited in college. I was like, wow, I'm really thinking very deeply about like how the Catcher in the Rye, captures like the 1950s and the existentialism of like that time and stuff. So it's
being
fun.
Curious, being just like, there's more to this than what's just on the surface.
Right.
That's an exciting way to think. So with your theater experience, this is kind of segueing nicely, because the way that I think of class structure is kind of like a play or a film, where you have something at the beginning that just like gets you excited about, I don't know what's happening next. And then you do the things. So how does the last 15 minutes work in your classroom? What does that look like, your ending?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm probably a good person to have on simply because I'm not particularly good at it, but I'm not particularly bad at it. So I'm probably like a lot of teachers where sometimes I put a lot of thought into it and it works out. Yeah. And sometimes I'm like, I should have put more thought into this because now I don't have like a way to end class. So I have 4 different preps, and the one that I probably do the best at with the final 15 is my theory of knowledge class, because I really structured each lesson to be kind of its own thing within a bigger unit. So for example, right now, the big question is like, how do different perspectives affect the way we think of knowledge or the way we communicate knowledge? And so there'll be kind of a starter question to get them start thinking about it, and then I'll introduce some videos or some texts to start thinking about how perspectives work. And then I'll always have an exit ticket. So the exit ticket can be done a couple of ways. It can be like just a written response that they submit in Canvas, and so that will be the final 15. Or it can be a question where I want them to write something, but what they write isn't as important as the discussion I want to have in the last 15 minutes. So it'll be like, excuse me, all right, Johnny, what did you write? And then, okay, that's great. What do you guys think of that? Is that similar to what you've had? Okay. And so that's particularly good in the theory of knowledge, just because the way that I've structured the lessons don't necessarily run into each other. Like, you don't have to know that much from the previous lesson to participate in the current lesson. The way it works in like sci-fi fantasy literature is a little bit different, because now I do need you to have some knowledge from prior classes. Gotcha. I need you to know where we are in the class novel. I need you to remember like what character we looked at from a chapter from another novel or a short story or something like that. And so that one sometimes will be discussion driven. That one sometimes will be more of like a written response. Or like in mythology, it'll be kind of just an introduction to the next thing.
Oh, okay.
So in mythology, typically it's structured as day 1, we look at a new myth, right? And we go through the myth, we read it, and they're not long. They're like maybe 5 pages to read the myth. Then maybe we'll watch a YouTube video that kind of tells the myth in a slightly different way. And then the last 15 minutes of class is, let me introduce the project that we're going to do that kind of connects like modern life to the myth. Like what's something I can do that in some way makes you think of Pandora's box, but in a modern context.
And now that's what they would do the next class.
Right. And so some students are too burned out and they don't want to start it. Right.
Yeah.
But at least I've introduced it. So the next class, they're like, oh, okay, I remember him talking about this. Gotcha. And yeah, I got it. And some students aren't, and they'll get a head start on it, and they'll start working on it and stuff like that.
Okay. So it sounds like kind of a flexible period, like, hey, you could start working on this now.
Right.
Or you could just kind of
I always tell them to start working on it. Gotcha. But I don't get on them if they don't, because I know they're going to have time next class. Yeah. And so the students that want to, they can. And usually they have gone through quite a bit, like, because there'll be some kind of assignment asking them questions about the myth, like why it's important, how it relates to other myths that we've looked at in class or something like that. Yeah. So they've done, not a crushing amount of work, but a considerable amount of work just on learning the myth and thinking about the myth. Yeah. And then the final 15, sometimes in mythology, will be just the introduction to that project that we're going to do.
Yeah. And I guess for context, our classes are 90 minutes long. And so when you're talking about burnout, that totally checks out. That like you're trying to get kids engaged for a long time.
Right.
And 90 minutes it's a long time for an adult to play the game.
Yeah. But I think that's also important with like just how you structure your class. You did mention like how it is like a play. Like you have the first act, you have like the second act, sometimes the third act. Like films, for example, are divided into 3 acts typically. And you do need to think of it that way. What am I doing at the beginning of class? And if you do the same thing the whole time, it will be burnout every single day. And so you really do have to think about, okay, let's read an article at the beginning of class, and then we'll move on to reading some of the novel, and then we'll move on to like an assignment that's different than the novel. So I always try to think like, how am I going to break this up into at least 3 parts, sometimes more. So even on project days, so go back to mythology. Mythology will do, so that second day, okay, guys, this is the project, and I'll walk around, and a lot of times it's like filming stuff. So they'll film themselves talking about the myth or doing something like that, or they'll use like a slideshow where they're using their own voice to like narrate the slides. But then at the end of class, we'll take a quiz about the myth. So the idea is you've gone through the myth, you've learned about the myth. Now we've done this project to like reinforce the learning of the myth, why the myth's relevant, like in your mind. And then at the end of class for that, the final 15 will be, well, it's probably more like final 20 for the quiz, like a 10 to 12 question quiz about the myth itself.
Gotcha. And so I'm also wondering, so you talk about like you divide your class into 3, maybe 4 different parts. Are those different activities that you're collecting and they're producing like a product for each of those parts of your thing? Because that also sounds like it might be a lot of extra work and grading to do it that way, even though it might be good for students in education.
Yeah, it is. And you have to like, and I'll decide from time to time. So in Language Arts 10, for example, when I do this quarter, I did the literary unit and we read a novel. And I like to do as starters, like some kind of article that relates in some way to the novel. So we read The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. So I have a ton of articles that relate to like, what does a Native American school look like? How do Native American tribes deal with like addiction issues, which is another theme in the novel, like kind of the destructive nature of alcoholism. So I have all these different things, and depending on how tired I am, like, do I grade it? Or do I give participation points or something like that? But as long as they've read it and they've produced some kind of like, it's usually a quiz or a short answer, like what's the central idea of this article? And then give me 3 quotes from the article that support or highlight that central idea, something like that. And then we'll move on to the article or to the novel. And ideally, I've aligned it so that the article relates directly to something that's in that chapter that we're going to read or go over. And so that would be, so part 1 is the article, part 2 is the reading of the novel. And a lot of times I'll just read the chapters out loud. And this is helpful for language learners. It's helpful for kids who are a little bit below grade level oftentimes. And then we'll do a second chapter that they read on their own. So it's kind of like priming them. And then there'll be questions that deal with the chapter and stuff like that.
So kind of that classic, I do, we do, you do.
Right.
So I'm interested now, just my curiosity is wondering, with your theatrical background, how do you read those chapters? Do you put a little spice on it sometimes?
Definitely. I'm extremely good at it.
And I love that.
That novel in particular, because I've read it every single year.
Yeah.
Like since 2014, I think is when I started here. I've read it every year, so I know it extremely well. I like know when to get upset. I know when the jokes are coming. Okay. I know when to like stretch it out and just make it super uncomfortable until I start to hear laughter in the class.
Nice.
So yeah.
That's good. How do you find, do you use that kind of same theatrical performance skill throughout all of your classes? So what does that look like?
So here's an example that I love, right? Kids hate working in groups. There's just something about like modern students where they do not want to talk to each other. Yeah. And if you have sophomores first period, it is pure agony. So what I do is I set up the assignment and say, okay, well, this is the thing you're going to discuss at your table. And this is the thing, this is what you're going to produce from that discussion. And then I wait, just give it a beat for that uncomfortableness to go, you're all feeling it now, aren't you? Just feel it. You feel that social anxiety. You're just feeling it. And you just try to take what you know is already happening and turn it into a little bit of a joke. Yeah. And then you just walk around to each table and just like you won't even look at each other, will you? Look how much you don't want to do this. You don't even want to look at this person. That's how much. Look at him. Just look him in the eyes. Just feel that deep social uncomfortableness.
Oh my gosh.
And that usually breaks the ice enough that then we can start doing it.
So I'm curious now, I'm sure this is probably more prevalent at the beginning of a school year.
Yes.
Does it get better? Like, do those classes, do you find by the end of the year, like, all right, this is Mr. Bishop's class. I'm just going to do it because I don't want him to look at me with that face.
But it takes a while. I mean, it can take to December sometimes, especially with sophomores, because they're acclimating their behavior to high school anyway. Sophomores are fascinating because you do get this like middle school mentality through first quarter for sure. And then by December, sophomores start to look more, they've had juniors and seniors have modeled like what behavior is. The teachers have made the expectations clear. So their behavior changes, but also they know each other now. I think that's the weirdest thing, is that they're coming, often from 2 or 3 different schools. So they don't know each other, whereas juniors and seniors typically know each other. They've seen each other around. But yeah, it takes months to get that to work the way you want it to work.
Yeah.
And you have to power through it. And sometimes it's a total failure. Sometimes you'll be at that one table and you're just like, so you guys, this is the table that just won't talk to each other.
We're not doing it.
And you just have to, in a weird way, bully them. Like, what do you think? What do you, just tell me what you think. Did you hear what they said? Okay, now you think. And you have to it is painful, but eventually they get there. Not all of them. There'll still be some kids that just won't ever talk. And you just kind of have to accept that, and hopefully they're writing enough or giving you enough to demonstrate it outside of like the group discussion part.
Yeah. And so it sounds like for that kind of thing to take place, there has to be some pretty solid relationship building, because you can't just come into a class and that's the only way you interact with them, right? So what other things do you do to help them understand that you're not actually a bully, that you are their teacher?
Yeah, I mean, humor is like the best thing you can do, like when you're talking to them about the novel or about something that happened at the school. Like, I find that like being funny is helpful to like build those relationships. And then anytime you can just walk around the room and talk to people and get them on your side, like, hey, I know you were absent last time. I just want to let you know you did miss this quiz. It's available in Canvas. Or, we read this article last time. It's not available in Canvas because it's a starter, but you had an excused absence, so I want to make certain that you're able to do it. And just that type of thing, and just talking to kids individually, I think always gets them on your side, and they feel more comfortable talking to you because they feel like, oh, he's trying to help me, that type of thing.
I think I relate to that a lot. That's one of my favorite things to do, especially at the beginning of the school year, or maybe if I have a semester class that year, at the beginning of whenever I meet them, to like spend that first day just talking to every single kid about whatever they want to talk about. And then making that a pattern throughout the day. Like, I'm going to talk to everybody because it helps me to know where the limits are with some kind of sarcasm. Because I think, like you, I am a rather sarcastic teacher at times.
Yes.
I do voices. I have a teenager voice that I will use when I'm saying like, oh, this is really hard, Mr. Densley.
Yes.
And so you kind of learn more about your students when you do build those relationships. So you can do like, is this, what is this today? Like, you're not doing it.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's funny. I try to do it more like to the class, so nobody feels that I'm being sarcastic, like directly to them.
Gotcha.
Because yesterday I did do that because it's the end of the quarter. Yeah. So I did kind of a teenager voice, like, oh, Mr. Bishop, nothing is my fault. I know that I missed all of the deadlines, but nothing is literally my fault. It's obviously somebody else's fault. So I'm going to send you 15 emails about this thing that's clearly not my fault. And it wasn't directed towards anyone,
but just a general PSA.
Right. Yeah. It's just like, just to lighten the mood and to, try to get them to understand, like, no, you guys are seniors in high school. Yeah. Like, you need to start feeling some responsibility for your own work and your own life. And you can't expect your teachers and parents to solve all your problems anymore. Yeah. It's funny. But again, most kids find it funny. Maybe the ones that don't, I'm just not aware of or anything like that. Yeah. And some kids you have to be aware of. If they have, I have a student in my sci-fi fantasy class who's autistic, and he will constantly raise his hand for stuff. Yeah. And I've just learned to be like, is this important? This better be good. I'm right in the middle of monologuing here. I'm being hilarious up here. So this better be good. Is it good? Yeah. And he's like, oh, I could wait. And so, you learn to the give and take there. So
that's cool. Reading the room. Yeah. And all of that. So I'm giving a training for the new teachers today, and about the final 15, and I kind of want to audition an idea and see what your thoughts are. Okay. So we were talking about how, classes can sometimes be structured like a play. A popular thing with novelists and like chapter specific media, whether it's like a show that's streaming, they end in some disastrous way that makes you like, and you have to watch the next one. And so I was thinking last night, as I was like, all right, so what am I doing? What am I going to help them with? And I had that thought. I'm like, okay, so here's a situation. What if you end your lesson on like a massive cliffhanger, and then the bell rings, and you're like, well, and I guess we're going to have to find out next time. So for this training, I'm considering starting the training, having a plant. Somebody asked me about a field trip that I took recently to Antelope Island, which I did.
Yeah.
And talking about like, oh yeah, we were there. We did this little hike. Then there was some bison in a field. So we pulled over, looked at them. This is all true so far. We're seeing them, but there's just one that's kind of close, making me feel a little nervous. So I move all of my kids back to the vans, and I hear somebody talking to me, and I'm doing a head count and realized that I am short one student, and this bison is looking at me in the eyes. So I want to now talk about the final 15. Like how's it been going in your class? And just trying to get them think like, there's got to be more to that story. Yeah. How close was the bison? Like,
right.
It was very close. If they had whites of their eyes, I would have seen them. And then kind of at the end of that little mini train, because it'll only be like maybe 15, 20 minutes to kind of come back and say, all right, if you were curious about how that story ends, that could be another way you could end your class.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And it just made me think of another example. This girl in my mythology class told us this story about how she wants to date this boy, the boy's dating this other girl. And so I've actually used that as a cliffhanger and just be like, find out what, I won't use her real name, Sally's continuing drama is. Tune in next time. She's going to give us an update.
That's funny.
So anything you can do that like drives that idea, like coming back is interesting. Like whether it's the content we're talking about, whether it's like the social interactions we've talking about, or whether like it's just the teacher's funny and has funny stories. Because I think it gets a little bit lost in all the teacher JPass stuff that we do, which is all important, and I'm not diminishing it, but like how important like your personality is to the class and how much that helps certain students connect with you because they get your sense of humor. I have a lot of students in my like sci-fi class right now. They clearly have no interest in sci-fi or fantasy literature. They just think I'm funny. And so I had them as sophomores and they've taken the class now as seniors. Right. Not because they want to read Mistborn or Lord of the Rings, but because they're just like, oh, Mr. Bishop's funny. And so that is helpful. So I think any kind of like, I hesitate to call it a gimmick, but in some ways it's a gimmick, right? He ends the class with like cliffhangers sometimes, and whether it's a story, whether it's true, whether it's something like that is funny. And anytime you can get student stories also engaged with that, I think would be super helpful as well. Yeah,
and I think I appreciate the idea of like expanding beyond like these are the teacher things that we have to do, and realizing that. Well, I mean, we're in the driver's seat of this. Like, we can do it kind of however we want.
Definitely.
As long as our primary goal is helping students learn cool stuff.
Yeah.
And feel safe and seen in a classroom.
Right.
I definitely appreciate that, having your own personality idea as well.
Can I tell you another story?
I would love it.
From last year, I had a student who, I don't remember what prompted this, but he was like, what are you doing for your wife on Valentine's Day?
Oh, I've gotten that question.
And I'm like, I haven't really thought about that. And I said, I'm not really sure yet. And he like kind of gave me a hard time. He's like, Mr. Bishop, you got it. She's your girl, man. I'm like, you know what? Thank you, Sam. I'm going to take that into consideration. Yeah. And so that became a running joke, is like, and it was kind of like a cliffhanger. I'm going to let you guys know next time how it went, what we did. And so like for like a couple of months, it was like, I took the day off on Monday because my wife had it off, so we went and had lunch. And they were like fascinated by like the stuff that my wife and I did. It was like kind of romantic, but kind of what married couples do.
Normal middle-aged married people do. That's what we do.
And so it was kind of funny. So anything you can find like that, I think is helpful. And if you can end the class like that, it's really helpful, because then it ends on like a positive, interesting note, and there's usually some carryover to the kids who are invested anyway.
Right. And so I guess I want to make this point, obviously not to you, but to people who are listening who may be new teachers, an experience that I had as a new teacher, kind of understanding this for the first time, is my mentor teacher who I student taught with had me visit other classrooms and watch him. He's an excellent teacher. You know, Richard, he's the man.
He's awesome.
Richard, we got to get you on the show
Sure.
sometime. That'd be great. But he taught me a lesson. I was trying to do something in the same way that he did it in a lesson. And then afterwards, he was pretty frank with me, like, you can't do that. That's not your thing.
Yep.
You got to do your own thing.
Yeah.
I don't even remember exactly what it was or what the lesson was about, but that lesson for me specifically was like, oh, I am not Richard. I am not these other teachers. They're excellent teachers. And so for anyone who's listening, think like, oh, yeah, I got to do funny voices and I got to, be sorry. But maybe you do, but maybe you just got to lean into what is your thing. I found that my thing is I am an awkward person sometimes. And I've embraced it. I'm like, I'm awkward in front of teenagers and I don't care.
Yeah.
But that's kind of become an endearing sort of thing to some of my students. Like, oh, Mr. Densley tells weird dad jokes. Yeah. And sometimes his jokes don't land and he's the only one laughing, but I appreciate that, And so, yeah, I think there's great value in finding your own voice in teaching.
Yeah. What's your skill set? Like, can you identify what your skill set is when interacting with students? And can you highlight that? So in language arts, like we all kind of follow the same program for each grade level, but we always say this to our new teachers, like this is what we're doing, but you have to figure out how to do it like on your terms, what your classroom looks like, things like that. So don't feel that you need to like copy everything we're doing that's kind of on our schedule for the year, because it's not going to work for everyone in the same way.
No,
right?
No. And it shouldn't, because just like we're all individuals, our students are all different. And there's a reason why there's many teachers instead of just one teaching the whole school.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay. So we're kind of coming down to the end. What would be like your top 3 takeaways? Maybe 2 things that you would say for sure do this in the last 15, and then maybe one thing that you want to still try to get better at in the last 15.
I think like exit tickets are really good. Like how do you reinforce like the big idea of the lesson? And that can be a simple like, hey, I just want 2 sentences, 3 sentences in Canvas, or I want to see everyone talking about this, discussion prompt at their table, something like that. Like I found that to be the best, is just to reinforce like what it is that we went over that day. And it can be like an informal assessment, or it can be just a discussion. I think for me, like, and this is probably true of a lot of teachers, it's just like really building that in, because sometimes it's not built in. Sometimes I'll wing it at the end and it turns out okay.
Yeah.
And I don't hate the way it went, but more thought could have gone into it for sure.
Yeah. So just making it a more purposeful, like I did this at the beginning.
Yes.
I did this in the middle. This is my end on purpose.
Yeah. And I do appreciate the training we've gotten this year kind of making us do that, because it did force me to think about it. Like I'm not thinking enough about it. Yeah. In certain classes I have, and in other preps I haven't. So that's been helpful. Yeah.
And I think also if we're thinking of that cliffhanger idea of doing something like that, that makes it separate from like an anthology series where there are individual episodes to a story. And depending on the class, like your TOK class is probably more of that anthology where the cliffhanger, the thing at the end that gets them to come back next time is how things worked, like the form of the lesson.
Right.
But for another class, like, oh, really, what are we doing next? How does this all come out even at the end? Or does it? Yeah. Right. Okay. Fantastic. Chandler, thank you so much for joining us. If you are interested in more episodes of the Think Like a Teacher podcast, check them out wherever podcasts are sold or streamed.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome.